Welcome back to Simply Sakura's MotoVlog and True Crime stories, everyone. But just letting you know, I've really been enjoying doing this and doing all the research for, for these stories, and I'm hoping that you guys are really enjoying this. It's absolutely another beautiful day in the neighborhood here, and just a beautiful afternoon to tell another true crime story while I travel about through the city here. So with that, let's begin with the true crime story of Robert Ben Rhoades, aka the truck stop killer. The Peterbilt semi-truck was pointed toward Tucson in the dark, early morning hours of April 1st, 1990. Arizona State Trooper Mike Miller was on duty that night. As Miller was on his beat that night, he noticed the trucker was having some difficulty. The semi-truck, you see, had its hazard lights flashing while it was parked on a curb off of Interstate 10, just within the city limits of Casa Grande. Those flashing lights were attracting Trooper Miller like a moth into one of those bug zappers. It annoyed Miller, but what the trooper stumbled upon was a scene that played out on one of those Friday the 13th horror movies. Miller's decision to stop that early morning came just in the nick of time. It was the first in a series of horrifying chain of events. Trooper Miller took out his flashlight and proceeded to walk around the truck. Miller was actually trying to look for the driver of the truck. Well, immediately, Miller heard some commotion coming from inside of the truck cab. He decided to walk to the left driver's side of the truck. Trooper Miller stepped on the truck's runner so that he could peek inside to see what all the ruckus was about. Well, as Trooper Miller opened the truck's passenger side door, he could not imagine in a million years what he was about to stumble upon. As soon as Miller flashed his light towards the sleeper cab, he had to catch his breath for a moment when he noticed a nude woman with a gag over her mouth. She was shackled and chained to the truck's cab sleeper wall. The woman was screaming frantically when she saw Trooper Miller. Miller immediately noticed a man scrambling through the curtains which separated the sleeping cab from the truck's front seats. Trying to remain calm as the woman kept screaming, Miller moved to the driver's side of the truck and immediately ordered the man out. Oddly, he complied, calmly assuring Trooper Miller that everything was all right. The man also informed Miller that he was carrying a gun. The truck driver, Robert Ben Rhoades, tried to explain that the whole situation and the whole incident was just a private and consensual matter. Rhoades' composure and the woman's terrified shrieks were more than what Trooper Miller could attend to at once. So Miller took Rhoades' wrists and handcuffed them behind his back, and then immediately put Rhoades in his patrol car. With Rhoades out of the way, Miller returned to the woman and saw that she was badly wounded. She had red welts all over her body and cuts all over her mouth. She had a horse bridle strap around her neck and then a long chain padlock to the horse bridle. Her hands and ankles were also handcuffed. Seeing all this, Trooper Miller immediately called for backup. Miller, in the meantime, tried to console the young female, but she was way too terrified and worried that Rhoades would return to continue hurting her. Well, Miller was relieved when a backup officer at the Casa Grande police station pulled up. That officer freed the woman with the handcuff keys that Trooper Miller managed to find inside Rhoades' pocket. She was taken into the Casa Grande police station. At that police station, the 27-year-old female explained how she was hitchhiking to visit some friends when she accepted a ride from the polite truck driver. Grateful for some rest, she fell asleep in the passenger seat and immediately woke up being shoved into the sleeper cab. The young female Trooper Miller found chained on Interstate 10 detailed to detectives how her kidnapper had laid down a white towel before torturing and raping her, and how Rhoades bragged that he had been doing it for years, and how he's always gotten away with it. At the police station, Rhoades was calm and quietly dismissive, claiming the woman chained in his truck was a lot lizard, a consenting prostitute who was not playing with a full deck. Rhoades was acting all chummy with the officers as he tried to persuade them that, the nasty business of the shackled woman in his truck was not a big deal and that it was, all her idea. This tactic of doubt had worked for him before, but this time the victim was not afraid and she would not back down. Rhoades was booked for aggravated assault, sexual assault, and unlawful confinement. When the detectives viewed the evidence obtained from Rhoades' truck, they knew they were dealing with a prolific serial rapist. Agents searched Rhoades' Houston home and recovered photographs, woman's clothes, and white towels stained with blood. The abused woman in the photographs had two things in common. They all had extremely short hair, and they were either bound or handcuffed. At the time, Rhoades was facing only kidnapping and assault charges. But as authorities would soon learn, Robert Ben Rhoades, aka the truck stop killer, was actually one of the most dangerous sex offenders and serial killers in American history. Born November 22, 1945 in Council Bluffs, Iowa, Robert Ben Rhoades was in trouble with the law almost from the start. While in high school, he was arrested for tampering with a vehicle, and then again for fighting in public before Rhoades, decided to join the Marines. Soon after, in 1964, Rhoades' father was arrested for molesting a 12-year-old girl, and he committed suicide before his trial began. A few years later, Rhoades himself was back in trouble with the law for an armory that saw him dishonorably discharged from the Marines. By the 1970s, Rhoades landed work as a truck driver. Truckers knew Rhoades by his CB handle, whips, and chains. This self-appointed name was a reference to his favorite activity of S&M. Rhoades was a smooth talker and an outgoing guy who wasn't at all shy about his hobby. A photo from the early 1980s, given to law enforcement by the family member, showed Rhoades beaming, dressed head to toe in leather and chains. Rhoades married a third wife in Houston. Rhoades' wife explained to detectives how Robert often organized orgies and how he pressured her to perform in the S&M fantasies. She reportedly told the FBI that strange men began appearing at her house, explaining that Robert had hired them to be sex slaves. A young woman had escaped Rhoades in 1989 and went to the police, describing how she was being held captive and repeatedly tortured and raped. When Rhoades arrived at the police station to answer for his accusations, he was cool, calm, and collective. The woman, you see, was a prostitute. Rhoades claimed and clearly said she was crazy. The woman recanted her confession, fearing for her safety and thinking the police would not trust the word of a prostitute. Rhoades' first confirmed victims happened in January of 1990. Newlywed hitchhikers Patricia Candace Walsh Zykowski and Douglas Zykowski left Seattle, and they were hitchhiking to Georgia to attend a religious workshop. Robert shot Douglas immediately and dumped his body in Texas. Robert, though, decided to keep Patricia for over a week, repeatedly torturing and raping her before Rhoades ultimately shot her to death. It took almost 13 years for detectives to identify Patricia's body after deer hunters ended up finding her body near the mouth of a canyon in Millard County, Utah. Patricia's identity was confirmed only by dental records. The crime that ultimately earned the truck stop killer a life sentence was the rape and murder of Regina K. Walters, a 14-year-old girl from Pasadena, Texas. Regina was hitchhiking with her boyfriend Ricky Jones when Robert Ben Rhoades picked them up in February of 1990. Robert promptly killed Ricky, but he kept Regina hostage for several weeks or even more in what has been called his traveling torture chamber. Meanwhile, Robert took several photographs of Regina as he held her captive. Photographic evidence seized during a search of Robert's home revealed photos showing different lengths of Regina's hair growth and various bruising, indicating that Robert held her for a decent amount of time. What's really bizarre is, during Regina's imprisonment, Robert would even call Regina's father from payphones. During one call, Robert told Regina's father that, "Hey, I cut your daughter's hair," and then hang up. After Robert tortured Regina with fishing hooks and other sadistic instruments, Robert took one final set of photographs of Regina just before killing her, with baling wire that was attached to a wooden handle. The wire had been twisted so many times beyond the point needed for death. Afterwards, Robert threw Regina's body in a barn off of Interstate 70 in Illinois. Regina's body was found in the barn loft when a farmer discovered her decaying body bound to a beam in the barn in rural Illinois. She was confirmed through dental records as Regina Walters of Pasadena, Texas. She was last seen in February 1990 near Houston, along with her boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones. Among the evidence seized from Rhoades' home was a series of photographs of a terrified girl, her hair cut short, standing in front of an old barn. Eerily, the FBI's crime scene photos matched exactly the same barn, photographed from the same angle, with the body in the same position. The only difference was in that Rhoades' photos showed Regina alive. In the FBI photos, Regina was not. Robert Ben Rhoades was convicted for the Regina K. Walters murder in 1994 and sentenced to a life behind bars in Illinois. But authorities couldn't get him for anything else. After Rhoades began serving his sentence, though, he started confessing to other murders committed during his lifelong time on the road. For one, Rhoades only faced consequences for the murders of Patricia and Douglas Zykowski in 2012, more than 20 years after the crimes he had committed. After a year-long pre-trial, the truck stop killer pleaded guilty to both murders, and he received another life sentence as part of the deal with prosecutors so this nutbag could avoid the death penalty. Law enforcement cross-referenced Rhoades' trucking logs with records of a young woman that went missing over a 15-year span. Rhoades' truck logs placed him in the area of 50 unsolved murders. Investigators believe Rhoades ultimately tortured, raped, and killed at least 50 women, or as many as 1 to 3 women a month. Investigations revealed Rhoades' crimes followed a similar pattern. If someone was looking for a ride, Rhoades would offer it to them. The men were immediately killed, and the women were held captive for days or weeks in his mobile torture chamber. Rhoades' truck was certainly equipped for the job. Authorities found a dungeon-like compartment between the seats, as well as handcuffs on the ceiling so that the victims could be chained and tortured. Everywhere Rhoades went, he brought a very well-detailed briefcase, which contained leashes, whips, handcuffs, alligator clips, pins, fish hooks, and sex toys. But without confessions or hard evidence, we may never know how many people the truck stop killer murdered during his bloody reign all those years ago. While authorities suspect there are dozens of unsolved murders hidden within Robert Ben Rhoades, one recently surfaced story from his past had something of a happy ending, though. In 2015, several law enforcement agencies shared a photo of a young woman taken by Rhoades inside his truck in 1985 on Facebook. It was on the same roll as the shots of Regina K. Walters. The authorities figured the woman was probably another victim of the truck stop killer, and they were looking to identify her. But then, a woman from Saskatchewan recognized that the young woman in that picture was her. How crazy is that? She was hitchhiking to find her brother in Winnipeg when she ended up in Rhoades' truck. When he snapped a photo of her just as she was getting into the truck, she asked why he was taking her photo, and he just told her that he kept photos of his passengers so he could show them to the cops in case anyone would ever rob him and flee. Robert said he was going to Florida, and he wanted her to come along. At one point, Robert pointed to a sign on his dashboard. Get this, here's what it said: cash, grass, or ass. No one rides for free. Well, the young girl didn't have any money, nor did she want to smoke pot, so unfortunately she opted for the third offer. Robert ended up dropping her off at a bus depot in Winnipeg. And of course, many were not as lucky as her. And while the truck stop killer will never see the light of day, we may never know how many lives Rhoades actually took. Rhoades was convicted of first-degree murder of Regina K. Walters in 1994 and sentenced to life without parole. Rhoades was then extradited to Utah in 2005 to be tried for the newlyweds of Patricia and Douglas Sikowski. Then, he had to go to Texas for the death of Ricky Lee Jones. In exchange for dropping the death penalty, Rhoades pleaded guilty to murdering Jones and received a second life sentence. Rhoades, who just turned 75 4 days ago, is currently serving 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole at a prison in Chester, Illinois. Anyway, this concludes the story of Robert Ben Rhoades, and I do hope you found it interesting. There are plenty more motovlog and true crime stories coming soon. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. If you have any comments, I highly encourage that you leave them down below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.